Welcome back to Every Third House by Margery Frisbie. Chapter 12. Tracy didn't think she could stand it if a bunch of kids got in Mrs. Embry's car and talked all the way home about what birds they had added to their life lists. It would be worse if they didn't talk about anything, though. Silence all the way home would drive her crazy. She knew they were wondering how to act in front of her. She didn't much relish a repetition of Mrs. Embry's outburst about God in his heaven either. What choice do I have, Tracy thought. I can't walk home. Why did I ever come, she accused herself. At least I can get away from Snoops at home. There was nothing to do but wait to see who she'd have to face from here to Dunton Avenue. Tracy could see Mrs. Embry parleying intensely with Mrs. Prescott, dividing the kids into groups. Alan had pulled up his father's car to the end of the parking lot. The engine was running. As much as she dreaded the possibility of being alone with Mrs. Embry, Tracy dreaded chattering or silent kids more. Or did she? Her mind seesawed between kids or no kids. She decided she'd prefer kids to an empty car. That wasn't the way it worked out. Mrs. Embry strode up as if she had the situation in hand, closed the passenger door, walked around and opened the driver's door silently. She waved her hand in farewell as she passed the other cars and drove out of the parking lot. Tracy braced herself for explanation or cross-examination. There was neither. Mrs. Embry didn't explain how they'd fit all the kids in the other cars. She didn't comment on Tracy's crying. She simply drove through the gate and turned east on Palatine Road. They passed more cars than they had seen coming. The shadows from the basswoods and oak were shorter. Early morning expectations seemed to Tracy to have given way to harsher light on the highway, on the fields lining it, and, if I'm truthful with myself, on my own ability to cope, Tracy realised. I'd been scared about what my mother would do ever since she started being so suspicious, but I've assumed that I could stay in control, Tracy admitted to herself. I've prided myself on not breaking under the stress. But now I'll have to admit I've broken down. Tracy tried to reconstruct the morning, wondering what had triggered her berserk reaction, her falling apart. For that's how it felt, she thought, shivering at the recall of her loss of control, at being awash in a sea of troubles. She turned slightly towards Mrs. Embry, as if the counsellor could read her thoughts, catch her quoting Shakespeare as Mrs. Embry herself had quoted Browning earlier, precipitating the unexpected crisis. Mrs. Embry reacted to Tracy's shift in position, saying encouragingly, "Yes?" "Nothing," Tracy said. They were turning onto Northwest Highway now. Pretty soon they would be home. And what would poor Tracy do then? Poor thing. This is too much, Tracy remonstrated with herself. Where did that come from? Another literary illusion, as Mrs. Farley Gossett would say. Immediately, Tracy could hear the words in her head in her mother's voice. How many times had she repeated those comforting sounds in her low alto voice, half singing them, something she must have loved doing to keep it up for so long, Tracy realised. The words trilled through her head. And what will poor Robin do then? Poor thing. He'll sit in a barn to keep himself warm and hide his head under a wing. Poor thing, Tracy had said it aloud. She waited, nerves at the ready, eyeing Mrs. Embry's profile, waiting for a reaction. No need to worry. The traffic was much heavier. Everyone was doing Saturday errands. Mrs. Embry concentrated on the road. Once they had a clear lane on the highway, Mrs. Embry repeated the phrase. "Poor thing," she said, too casually for Tracy's comfort. "Who's a poor thing?" It must have been the bird watching, Tracy fudged. I was thinking of an old nursery rhyme my mother loved. And what will poor Robin do then, poor thing? It just slipped out. Tracy. Here we go, Tracy counted in her mind, stiffening her body. Tracy, Mrs. Embry began again, very slowly, weighing each word. Don't you see a connection between that particular nursery rhyme and your finally admitting, I'm not sure you've admitted anything, your reaction to the stress you've sat on for so long? I don't know why that happened, why I cried. Tracy stared out of the car window at a metro train headed for Chicago. I should never come on this bird hike. I should have gone downtown. Then this wouldn't have happened. Alan wouldn't be driving home thinking what a wimp I am. I can just imagine those kids talking, saying, "What do you suppose happened to Tracy?" Agreeing I'm not as much fun as I used to be. How can I go back to school after all this? "Maybe I'm coming down with something," Tracy suggested desperately to Mrs. Embry. Tracy's mother had often noticed that Tracy got weepy before she got sick. "Tracy, you told me yourself how Abraham Lincoln, saint that he was, finally admitted to the butcher that he suffered with Mary. Are you going to be braver than Abraham Lincoln?" They were almost home now. Tracy could see Bill Cook Buick, where Jan worked after school. She wished she was across the desk from Jan instead of across the car from Mrs. Embry's interrogation. "Mary Lincoln was much worse than my mother, if that's what you mean," she told Mrs. Embry. "She never yelled at my father the way Mary Lincoln yelled at the president." "Come on, Tracy." Mrs. Embry's tone was brisk, almost curt. You know I wasn't referring to your mother. I was referring to you. Being overly brave is sure to catch up with you." "Who's brave?" Tracy felt the tears start up again. Where did they all come from? She couldn't stand it. What would Mrs. Embry think? They were almost at her driveway. What would Grandma say if she saw her? Maybe I can sneak past and get to my room before she starts another inquisition. She didn't know if she meant Mrs. Embry or her grandmother. Maybe both. Mrs. Embry wasn't going to be eluded that easily. As she pulled up under the birch that Gracie's mother had planted in the side drive the year they'd moved in, she said, "I'm coming in to talk to your grandmother." Tracy tried to object, but she was afraid she would begin to cry and lose control again. Anything but that. Let Mrs. Embry talk to Grandma. She grappled with the door handle, irritated that all the knobs in the world didn't work the same way. Why couldn't it be a forthright handle like Alan's instead of a deliberately recessed, unavailable shaft? Tracy felt snared, trapped in this car and in her tears. No wonder she cried. She wanted to scream. Without comment, Mrs. Embry used her key to open the door on Tracy's side and held out a hand to her. Her touch made Tracy tense up, but she didn't pull her hand away until she was out of the car door. Mrs. Embry closed the door behind Tracy and followed her through the back door. From the bottom stair, Mrs. Embry called out, "Hello, I'm coming in with Tracy for a moment. Anyone home?" The door was closed at the top of the stairs. Mrs. Embry waited until Tracy opened it. She called out again. This time they heard footsteps from the second floor where Tracy's grandparents were using the bedroom that used to be her brother's. "That you, Tracy? I'll be right down." Grandma's voice carried over the lisp of running water and Grandpa's low baritone. She sailed down the stairs, an embroidered sweater over her pantsuit. Tracy would have sailed right past her to her own room, but Mrs. Embry's restraining hand on her shoulder prevented escape. Tracy stood there, quietly crying, waiting on her fate. Her mother was instantly aware of the tears. "Tracy, are you hurt? Did your teacher have to bring you home?" "She isn't hurt," Mrs. Embry said. "I'm her counsellor at school. Loretta Embry. Tracy's pretty upset. I wanted to talk to you about help for her." Mrs. Burkhart looked baffled. "Help how?" she asked. Tracy's grandmother patted her lightly on the head and held out a chair for Mrs. Embry. "Sit down, won't you?" she asked. "I'll put on a cup of tea." Tracy still wanted to flee, but Mrs. Embry blocked her, gently enough, and waved Tracy into a kitchen chair. Mrs. Burkhart carefully poured out the water in the kettle, refilled it at the sink, and reached out for the special occasion Bellique teapot. As Mrs. Embry and Tracy watched, she chose 3 teacups painted with rosebuds, found the sugar and sliced a lemon. Tracy stopped sniffling, diverted by Grandma's choice of her least favourite cups. Grandma's not a mug person, Tracy mused, although she is by no stretch an anti-Macassar grandparent. For an instant she compared Grandma's skill at creating a social occasion against her ability to create an atmosphere of intimacy. Once, after Tracy and her mother had watched an English movie, her mother had commented how her mother, like the British middle class, trusted a cuppa, to resolve all difficulty. Tracy could see her mother that night, sitting in the circle of light she deliberately created in this kitchen, drinking from her favourite peace mug, comfortable in her raggedy terrycloth robe. It had been one of their better moments, an occasion when Tracy thought they had connected. Staring at the few leaves settling in her cup, Tracy was hardly aware that her grandmother and Mrs. Embry had settled into serious conversation. "Maybe think I'll call Dr. McIntosh this afternoon," Tracy heard her grandmother tell Mrs. Embry. "I think Tracy goes to see her mother again tomorrow. Isn't that right, Tracy?" Tracy nodded. "Can't they tell I never want to see anyone, ever again?" she thought feverishly. "What do I have to say to Dr. McIntosh? What does my mother have to say to me?" She got up and turned to her grandmother. "May I go to my room now?" She could feel that fullness choking her again. It was all too much. Would these tears never end? She couldn't believe she was going to leave these two women to collaborate on her destiny. But she couldn't stay to protect her rights. Not one more minute. Once she'd heard a record of Alice in Wonderland at school, astounded to notice how often Alice burst into tears. She'd never noticed that Alice cried on every page when she read the book. She felt like that weepy Alice now. If someone were to write about the Saturday that Tracy Jenner went bird watching, she said to herself, the author would say that she cried on every page. She ran out of the room to hide the new waterfall, torrent, high tide, swell, the flood surging up in her throat. Until next time, good night.